Think about the last time you crossed the US border. Maybe it was an airport line, a passport scan, an officer in a booth asking how long you'd been away. Now here's something that might genuinely surprise you. For the first 148 years of this country's existence, there was no border patrol. None. For most of that time, there wasn't even a federal law telling most people they couldn't come in. If you could physically get here, you were in. And yet the country didn't collapse. More than 30 million people crossed the Atlantic in the century after 1820, and America absorbed them, built its railroads with them, filled Chicago and Cleveland and New York with them, became an industrial giant on their backs. So how did that actually work? Who, if anyone, was checking? What happened if you showed up sick or broke or wanted by the police back home? Could you really just walk across from Canada or Mexico? And if the door stood open for nearly a century and a half, what finally slammed it shut? Because this isn't trivia. What changed in 1924 rewired America's relationship with the rest of the world. It decided who your neighbor's grandparents got to be, and it invented a legal category that still dominates our politics 100 years later, the illegal immigrant. The answer runs through a swindler's paradise at the tip of Manhattan, chalk letters scrawled on the coats of strangers, poems carved into wooden walls, a Texas gunfighter riding a desert line alone, midnight steamship races into New York Harbor, and a freshman congressman from Brooklyn who nursed a grudge for 41 years, and won. So let me take you back to the beginning. The year is 1783. The Revolutionary War has just ended, and George Washington sits down to answer a letter from a group of Irish immigrants in New York. His reply contains a line that would quietly define American policy for the next century. The bosom of America, he writes, is open to receive the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, not just the useful ones, not just the rich ones, all of them. And here's the remarkable part. When the founders wrote the Constitution 4 years later, they backed that sentiment up by doing almost nothing. Search the Constitution for the word immigration, and you won't find it. Congress got power over naturalization, the legal process of becoming a citizen, but entry itself? Silence. The first Congress passed the Naturalization Act of 1790, which let a newcomer become a full citizen after just 2 years of living here. 2 years. Now, it's important to be honest about the fine print. That offer applied only to free white persons, a restriction that will come back to haunt this story. But as far as simply arriving on these shores went, the door had no lock, no doorman, and no list. The founders knew exactly what they were doing. The United States in 1790 held fewer than 4 million people. The whole country had roughly the population of modern Los Angeles, spread across a territory bigger than most European empires. They didn't just tolerate immigration. They needed it. Farmers, laborers, soldiers, taxpayers. Newcomers weren't a threat to be managed. They were the business model. That doesn't mean everyone loved the idea. The opposing instinct showed up almost immediately, and it never really left. In 1798, with America on the brink of war with revolutionary France, President John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which let the president deport any foreigner he judged dangerous. The laws expired, and the deportation power was never actually used on anyone. Verify. Standard accounts say no one was deported under the Alien Friends Act, though some fled voluntarily. By the 1850s, the fear had a mass movement. The Know-Nothings, a semi-secret fraternity of native-born Protestants convinced that Irish and German Catholics answered to the Pope instead of the Constitution. Members were instructed when asked about the organization to say, "I know nothing," which is how a political party ended up named after a shrug. At their peak, they controlled the Massachusetts legislature and ran former President Millard Fillmore for the White House in 1856. He got about a fifth of the popular vote. Then the movement shattered over slavery and vanished. Notice the pattern, because it repeats for 100 years. The fear of the newcomer is always present, and it keeps losing. But here's the critical detail most people overlook. During this entire era, to the extent anyone was managing immigration at all, it wasn't the federal government, it was the states. New York and Massachusetts, the great landing ports, charged shipmasters head taxes and bonds on the passengers they carried, and used the money to run hospitals and almshouses for immigrants who arrived sick or destitute. And in 1855, New York opened something remarkable at the southern tip of Manhattan, Castle Garden, a converted opera house that became America's first immigrant landing depot. To understand why it existed, you have to picture what greeted an immigrant before it did. The moment a ship docked, gangs of so-called runners swarmed aboard, sharp-dressed men, often speaking the newcomer's own language, German for the Germans, Irish accented English for the Irish. They'd grab your luggage as a courtesy, steer you to a boarding house that charged triple, sell you a railroad ticket to Buffalo that turned out to be worthless paper, and if you objected, your bags were being held hostage upstairs. It was an industry. Castle Garden was the state's answer, a walled compound where immigrants could land, exchange money at licensed rates, buy real tickets, and find work through an official labor exchange, all before the wolves got a shot at them. Read that again, because it tells you everything about the era's assumptions. America's first immigration station wasn't built to keep people out. It was built to help them in safely. Roughly 8 million people passed through Castle Garden, more than the entire population of New York City today. Then, in 1875, the whole arrangement collapsed on a technicality. In a case called Henderson versus Mayor of New York, the Supreme Court struck down the state head taxes, ruling that immigration was foreign commerce, and regulating foreign commerce belonged to Congress alone. The federal government didn't seize control of immigration. The Supreme Court forced it to take custody. And Congress, dragged into the job, responded with something almost comically modest. The Immigration Act of 1882, which charged each arriving passenger a head tax of 50 cents, about $15 in today's money, and barred convicts, lunatics, and anyone deemed likely to become a public charge. That was the gate, 50 cents and a once-over. A decade later, the federal government finally built its own front door. Ellis Island, opened January 1st, 1892. The first person through was a teenager from County Cork, Ireland, named Annie Moore, verify age, recorded as 17 on the manifest, though family tradition long said 15, who was handed a $10 gold piece for the honor, reportedly more money than she'd ever held. And the system she walked into worked, at least on its own terms. Inspectors checked names against ship manifests, and doctors performed what came to be called the 6-second physical, watching each arrival climb the stairs, breathing, gait, eyes, and chalking a letter on the coat of anyone who worried them. H for a suspect heart, L for lameness, E for eyes. A chalk mark meant a closer look. A clean coat meant America. At the peak, in 1907, over 1 million people came through this one building. On the single busiest day, April 17th, nearly 12,000 people, a sold-out basketball arena's worth of humanity, before dinner. And around 98% of everyone who reached Ellis Island got in. Flip that number around. Your odds of being rejected were about 1 in 50. For the great mass of European immigrants, America's border was a ferry ride and a 20-minute interview. Meanwhile, and hold on to this, the actual land borders, the thousands of miles separating the United States from Canada and Mexico, had nothing. No fences, no stations, no guards. The border was a line on a map that nobody stood on. Remember that line. But 3,000 miles to the west, in the goldfields and railroad camps of California, the open door was already swinging shut, for one group of people only, and that's where the trouble began. Chinese immigrants had been coming to California since the gold rush of 1849, and by the late 1860s they were doing some of the hardest labor on the continent. When the Central Pacific Railroad blasted its way through the Sierra Nevada, Chinese workers made up as much as 90% of its workforce. Men lowered in baskets down cliff faces to set explosive charges, tunneling through granite in the dead of winter. Then the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, the economy crashed in 1873, and suddenly those same men were competition. In San Francisco, a fiery Irish-born labor agitator named Dennis Carney, began holding torchlit rallies on empty sandlots, and every speech ended with the same 4 words: the Chinese must go. It's worth sitting with the irony that the loudest voice against immigrants was himself an immigrant, but the movement he rode was very real, and Washington listened. In 1875 came the Page Act, the first restrictive federal immigration law aimed on paper at convicts and women brought for immoral purposes, and enforced in practice so aggressively against Chinese women that it functioned as a near-total ban on them. Then on May 6, 1882, President Chester Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring Chinese laborers from entering the United States. For the first time in its history, America had shut its door on people because of where they came from. It was supposed to last 10 years. It was renewed in 1892, made permanent in 1902, and stayed on the books until 1943. This deserves to be said plainly, without softening. The first people the American border was ever built to stop were defined by race. The historian Erica Lee has argued that Chinese exclusion is where America learned to be a gatekeeping nation, that the paperwork, the interrogations, the whole machinery of deciding who belongs was invented here, on this one community, and only later applied to everyone else. And the machinery had to be invented, because a law is just words until someone enforces it, and enforcing this one turned out to be maddeningly hard. Chinese residents who were already citizens or merchants or students could still travel, which meant inspectors had to sort the exempt from the excluded with paperwork and interrogations. Then, in April 1906, the San Francisco earthquake and fire destroyed the city's birth records. Every one of them. And here's a fascinating detail most people don't realize. That fire punched a hole in the Exclusion Act that stayed open for decades. With no records to contradict them, Chinese men could claim they'd been born in San Francisco, making them citizens, and citizens could then send for their sons in China. Some of those sons were sons. Many were what became known as paper sons, young men who bought an identity and then memorized it from coaching books, how many steps led to the village well, which direction the ancestral hall faced, where the rice was stored in a house they'd never entered, study guides they burned or threw overboard before the ship reached port. Because waiting for them from 1910 onward was Angel Island, the immigration station in San Francisco Bay that people called the Ellis Island of the West. The nickname is misleading. Ellis Island processed most people in hours. At Angel Island, Chinese arrivals were locked in wooden barracks for weeks and sometimes months, grilled in interrogations that ran to hundreds of questions, their answers checked against relatives' answers for any contradiction. We know how it felt, because the detainees told us they carved poems into the barrack walls in classical Chinese verse. Poems about crossing an ocean to be caged, poems still legible in the wood today. When the station was slated for demolition in 1970, those carvings are what saved the building. Meanwhile, the exclusion laws created something else entirely new: smuggling routes. If you couldn't land at San Francisco, you could sail to Mexico or Canada and simply walk across that unguarded line on the map. So in 1904, the government scraped together its first ever answer to the land border, the Mounted Guard, a force of inspectors riding out of El Paso, Texas, and it never numbered more than about 75 men. 75. For a southern border of roughly 2,000 miles, that's one rider for every 25 miles or so of desert and river, with no radios, no roads worth the name, and no backup. Their most famous member gives you the flavor: Jefferson Davis Milton, a Texan who had joined the Texas Rangers at 15 by lying about his age, verify biographical details, had survived a train robbery shootout as a Wells Fargo guard that cost him the use of an arm, verify, and now rode long stretches of Arizona borderland essentially alone, one aging gunfighter and one horse, patrolling a frontier the size of a European country. Enforcement at this point wasn't a system, it was a personality, but the tools built to exclude one group of people never stay pointed at one group. Back east, 3 young men fresh out of Harvard were about to prove it. In 1894, in Boston, 3 recent Harvard graduates, Prescott Hall, Robert DeCourcy Ward, and Charles Warren, founded a small pressure group with a very tidy name, the Immigration Restriction League. Their alarm had a specific shape. Immigration itself wasn't new, but its sources were shifting fast. In the early 1880s, the overwhelming majority of arrivals came from Northern and Western Europe, Germany, Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia. By the early 1900s, roughly 3/4 were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, Russian Jews, Slavs, Greeks verify proportions. Different languages, different faiths, poorer, and in the League's eyes, a different and lesser stock. Their chosen weapon was elegant precisely because it looked neutral, a literacy test. Require every adult immigrant to read a short passage in some language, any language, nothing racial on its face. But everyone involved understood the aim, because schooling was scarce in the Sicilian countryside, and the Russian Pale in a way it wasn't in Hamburg or Stockholm. The League found its champion in Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, who said openly on the Senate floor that the test would bear most heavily on Italians, Russians, Poles, Hungarians, and Greeks, and least on English speakers. For Lodge, that wasn't a side effect. That was the point. Verify exact wording of Lodge's 1896 speech. What followed was a 20-year siege. In 1897, the literacy test passed both houses of Congress, and President Grover Cleveland, 2 days before leaving office, vetoed it, condemning it as a radical break from the open policy that had built the nation. Verify exact veto language. In 1913, it passed again. President Taft vetoed it. In 1915, again. President Wilson vetoed it. Think about that. 3 different presidents from both parties spent political capital defending open European immigration, because that's how deep the old consensus ran. But the political landscape was shifting beneath the surface, and in February 1917, with German U-boats sinking American ships and war weeks away, Congress passed the test a 4th time, Wilson vetoed it a 2nd time, and Congress overrode him. The Immigration Act of 1917 was law, a literacy test, an $8 head tax, and a newly drawn Asiatic barred zone that extended Chinese-style exclusion across nearly all of Asia. The restrictionists had besieged the gate for a generation and finally taken it. And here's what's extraordinary. The prize was a dud. European literacy had been climbing the whole time they'd been fighting, and when the test finally took effect, it turned away only a trickle of the people it was designed to stop. On the order of 1,000 or so rejections a year, verify figure. 20 years of struggle and the door barely moved. The restrictionists drew the obvious lesson. Testing individuals would never work. If you wanted to change who got in, you had to ration the numbers themselves. And then came the war. The First World War did what no law had managed. It shut down the Atlantic. Immigration fell from about 1.2 million people in 1914 to barely over 100,000 by 1918. Verify, roughly 110,000 in fiscal year 1918. A 90% collapse enforced by U-boats rather than statutes. And when the guns stopped, America was a changed and jumpier country. In June 1919, anarchist bombs went off in 8 American cities on a single night. One of them destroyed the front of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's house in Washington. The bomber, an Italian anarchist, was killed on the doorstep by his own device. Palmer's response became infamous. The Palmer raids of late 1919 and early 1920, in which thousands of foreign-born radicals and plenty of people who merely looked the part were rounded up. That December, the Army transport Buford, the press called it the Soviet Ark, sailed out of New York carrying 249 deportees to Russia, among them the anarchist celebrity Emma Goldman, who had lived in America for 34 years. Now add the other half of the panic. Europe was shattered, broke, and full of people desperate to leave. And in fiscal year 1921, more than 800,000 of them arrived, with officials warning that millions more were queued up behind them. A Congress marinating in Red Scare fear moved with startling speed. The Emergency Quota Act, signed in May 1921, capped immigration at roughly 357,000 people a year, each nationality limited to 3% of its foreign-born population as counted in the 1910 census. In one stroke, the numbers were cut by more than half. And the mechanics of that law produced one of the strangest spectacles in the history of New York Harbor. The quotas were doled out month by month, first come, first served, counted at the moment of arrival. So on the last night of every month, ocean liners loaded with immigrants would idle in the darkness just outside the harbor limits, boilers stoked, waiting. At the stroke of midnight, they raced, multi-thousand-ton steamships sprinting past the light ship like it was a regatta, each captain trying to land his passengers against the fresh month's quota before rival ships exhausted it. Verify specific incidents. The midnight quota races of 1921-1923 are widely documented in contemporary press. When a captain miscalculated, the arithmetic landed on human beings. Families who had sold everything they owned, standing at Ellis Island, told the month's allotment for their country had filled while they stood in line and sent back across the ocean. Not for illness, not for crime, for arithmetic. Nearly everyone in Washington agreed the 1921 law was a temporary patch. But the man determined to make it permanent had been preparing for years, and he believed things about human beings that would curdle the entire project. His name was Albert Johnson. Johnson was a Republican congressman from Hoquiam, H-O-Quiam, Washington, a small-town newspaper editor who had ridden anti-immigrant politics into Congress and, by 1919, into the chairmanship of the House Immigration Committee. And under Johnson, the committee didn't just hear from economists and labor leaders. It hired an official expert eugenics agent, a man named Harry Laughlin, L.O.F.Lin of the Eugenics Record Office, who presented Congress with charts purporting to show that Southern and Eastern Europeans carried inborn defects in their blood. Johnson himself served as honorary president of a National Eugenics Association, Verify the Eugenics Research Association, 1923, and books like Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race, which ranked humanity into superior and inferior stocks, supplied the intellectual wallpaper. This was pseudoscience. It was wrong then and it is repudiated now, but in 1924 it wore a lab coat and testified before Congress. Johnson's bill contained one deceptively boring sentence with a razor inside it. Quotas would now be set at 2% of each nationality's population as recorded in the census of 1890. Why reach back 34 years? Because 1890 was before the great Southern and Eastern European wave arrived. Choose that baseline and the discrimination does itself. It was arithmetic dressed up as neutrality. And on the House floor in April 1924, arithmetic met its heckler. Emanuel Seller was a 35-year-old freshman Democrat from Brooklyn, the grandson of German Jewish immigrants, representing a district full of exactly the people Johnson's baseline was designed to exclude. The confrontation between them wasn't a duel of equals. Johnson commanded the committee, the votes, and the national mood, but Seller made it a duel of ideas. Johnson declared from the floor that the day of indiscriminate welcome to all peoples had definitely ended, verify exact quotation. Seller rose to pull the mask off the census trick, demanding to know why a nation would measure itself by a 34-year-old snapshot if not to stack the deck, and denouncing the bill as discrimination dressed in scientific costume. Verify his exact floor language. He was eloquent. He was right about the arithmetic, and he was buried. The House passed the bill 323 to 71, verify vote count. Crushed. But as Seller watched the tally, something set in him that would outlast nearly every man in that chamber. Remember his name because this story doesn't end in 1924, and neither does he. First, though, the bill went to the Senate, where a single diplomatic letter from Tokyo was about to turn a domestic law into an international incident. Here the story slows down because the details matter. The Senate version of the bill contained a clause barring aliens ineligible to citizenship, legal code everyone understood, for the Japanese who under the racial rules of American naturalization law could not become citizens. Since 1907, Japan had voluntarily limited immigration under a face-saving arrangement called the Gentleman's Agreement. The new clause would rip that up and impose exclusion outright. In April 1924, Japan's ambassador in Washington, Masanao Hanihara, sent Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes a letter warning that exclusion would bring grave consequences for relations between the two countries. Hughes, who opposed exclusion, passed the letter to the Senate hoping it would help. It detonated. Henry Cabot Lodge, now 73 in the final months of his life, the same man who had carried the literacy test 3 decades earlier, rose to brand the phrase a veiled threat against the United States, and senators who had been wavering stampeded toward exclusion. The provision carried overwhelmingly. Verify margin. Final Senate passage of the full bill was 62-6. In Japan, the reaction was fury. Boycotts of American goods, mass protests, and a national day of humiliation when the law took effect. One protester committed ritual suicide near the American Embassy grounds in Tokyo. Verify incident details. Hughes privately despaired that Congress had undone years of diplomacy in an afternoon. It's important to be careful here. No serious historian draws a straight line from this law to Pearl Harbor 17 years later. But many, including biographers of Hughes, count it among the wounds that poisoned the relationship, and Japanese diplomats invoked the 1924 humiliation for decades. Verify. President Calvin Coolidge had already told Congress in his first annual message in December 1923 that America must be kept American. Still, he disliked the Japanese Exclusion Clause, and when he signed the Immigration Act of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, on May 26, 1924, he attached a statement saying that if that provision had stood alone, he would have refused to sign it. Verify exact statement. He signed it anyway. Look at what the new arithmetic did. Under the 1921 law, Italy's annual quota had been about 42,000 people. Under Johnson-Reed, it fell to 3,845. Verify exact figures. Fewer Italians per year than had once landed from Naples in a single busy week. Poland's quota fell to under 6,000. Meanwhile, Britain, Germany, and Ireland were handed the lion's share of a total that would settle around 150,000 a year for the entire world outside the Western Hemisphere. And Asia, with the exception of American colonies like the Philippines, was excluded almost entirely. The gates hadn't just narrowed. They had been rebuilt to a blueprint of the country's bloodlines, as they stood in 1890, and the numbers never came back. Annual immigration, which had topped 1 million people 6 times before the war, wouldn't approach those levels again for most of a century. Then, 2 days later, came the moment this whole video has been building toward you, and here's the detail most people overlook, because it's almost insultingly small. On May 28, 1924, Congress passed the Labor Appropriation Act, a routine budget bill, and tucked inside it was a single line item, $1 million for a land border patrol. That's it. That was the birth certificate of the United States Border Patrol. No founding debate, no grand statute, no signing ceremony. The agency that now defines the American border was created as a rider on a spending bill, 2 days after the law that created the very category of people it would spend the next century pursuing. The first force was authorized at about 450 men, paid $1,680 a year. Recruits had to supply their own horse and saddle. The government provided a badge, a revolver, and feed for the horse. Verify equipment details from official Border Patrol histories. They were ex-Texas Rangers, cowboys, wartime veterans, even railway mail clerks. Spread those 450 men across roughly 2,000 miles of Mexican border and several thousand more facing Canada, account for shifts and days off, and at any given hour you had something like one man for every 40-plus miles of line. The border finally had a body, it was just an extremely thin one. But the deepest change of 1924 wasn't the men on horseback. It was a new kind of person the law called into existence. The historian May Ngai, Ngai, verify preferred pronunciation, has made the defining argument here in her book Impossible Subjects. Before the quota era, there was no such thing as an illegal alien as a mass category, because for most people there was no law to be illegal under. After 1924, anyone outside the quotas who came anyway carried a permanent legal shadow, a status millions would eventually live inside. And notice who the system pointed at next. The Western Hemisphere was left off the quota lists entirely because Southwestern growers wanted Mexican labor. Mexicans could still immigrate legally, but now only through a gauntlet of visa fees, head taxes, literacy tests, and inspections that many crossing to harvest crops had never needed before and couldn't afford. So they crossed between the ports of entry, the way people always had, except now that act had a name and a police force. The historian Kelly Little Hernandez has shown that the early Border Patrol, whatever the law's global ambitions, concentrated overwhelmingly on Mexican workers almost from the start. In 1929, Congress went further and made unlawful entry itself a federal crime, a misdemeanor the first time, a felony on re-entry, a statute whose direct descendants are still prosecuted every day. Verify the 1929 act sponsored by Senator Coleman Livingston Blease. And the quota walls held even when the stakes became unbearable. In 1939, the liner St. Louis, carrying more than 900 Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, was turned away within sight of Miami's lights because the German quota was oversubscribed. The ship returned to Europe, and 254 of its passengers were later murdered in the Holocaust. A fair verdict has to hold two things at once. The restrictionist eugenics science was flatly, provably wrong, and its human cost was enormous. But the anxieties they exploited weren't invented from nothing. Industrial cities were straining, machines were replacing raw labor, and no society before or since has run permanently on unlimited entry. They were partly right that the old system couldn't last forever. They were catastrophically wrong about why. When you zoom out and look at this whole arc, from Washington's open letter in 1783 to $1 million and 450 horsemen in 1924, one theme runs through all of it. A border is not a fact of geography. It's a bureaucracy. It's a decision, renewed every generation, about who belongs and who doesn't, and it only becomes real when someone builds the machinery to enforce it. Remember that line on the map that nobody stood on? Today, roughly 20,000 Border Patrol agents stand on it, about 44 times the original force, backed by walls, sensors, drones, and databases. The line grew a body after all, and every piece of the modern system you might brush against, the visa interview at a consulate, the green card categories, the passport queue you stood in last summer, descends from 1924's core decision that entry to the United States is not a default but a ration, allocated by formula. Even the story's people came full circle. Remember Emmanuel Seller, the freshman from Brooklyn who was crushed 323 to 71? He never left Congress. He waited and rose and chaired the House Judiciary Committee, and on October 3, 1965, 41 years later, he stood at the foot of the Statue of Liberty as President Lyndon Johnson signed the Hart-Celler Act the law Seller co-authored, abolishing the national origins quotas for good. The grudge won, and the open door he was defending had already made the country you live in. Something like 40% of Americans can trace at least one ancestor through Ellis Island alone, verify commonly cited estimate. Through the same doors, Annie Moore walked with her $10 gold piece. So, which America was better? The one where anyone could walk in, or the one where a formula decides? Honestly, whether that world was better or worse than this one depends entirely on what you value. The freedom of movement that built the country, or the control that every modern state now treats as its birthright. Both are defensible. Both have a body count. What doesn't change is the question underneath, the one this country has been arguing about since 1798 and hasn't settled yet. Who decides who belongs here, and in whose interest? If this story shifted how you see the border, subscribe. This channel goes deep on the hidden systems that shape your world, the laws, the ledgers, and the lines on maps that most people never think to question, so you understand how things actually got this way. And here's one to sit with until next time. For most of American history, you didn't need a passport to enter or leave the country at all. That story is coming soon, and you will not want to miss it.